Today she's going to be telling you all about the search for Atlantis in the Bahamas and the Caribbean. So without further ado, I shall pass you on to Lora Little. Thank you.
Good morning. I've got lots to show and hardly enough time to do it, so I'm going to get started. My talk today will be on just one portion of the explorations that Greg and I have been involved in, and this will primarily be about the Bahamas. However, it's really about Edgar Cayce's ARE search for the Bahamas. Am I close enough? Yeah, that's probably better, isn't it? All right, I need to tell you a little bit about Edgar Cayce's story of Atlantis. I'm going to tell you about the overview of the Atlantis research in the Bahamas. I'm going to tell you about an incredible site that we didn't discover it, but our Bahamian colleagues identified this particular site, and it's pretty exciting in the Bahamas. And then there's been a new discovery in Egypt, which I understand is so new that some of you may not have heard about it. And it was given to me last weekend by John Van Auken, if some of you are familiar with him. He's ARE's Egypt researcher. But let's start with Edgar Cayce's story of Atlantis. How many of you know who Edgar Cayce is? Ah, good. So I don't have to really go into a whole lot of detail. He's a 20th century mystic, psychic. He was born in 1877, died in 1945. He was a contemporary of Rudolf Steiner, so it's quite interesting. They didn't know each other, but their information's very similar, so it's interesting to me to be in this particular location. He also was a contemporary of Carl Jung, who's an important teacher and a person that I've studied. He's the most documented psychic in history. They consider him the father of holistic medicine because most of his, actually 80% of his readings were about health. He did 14,700 plus readings on over 10,000 topics, just depended on what people asked questions about. And 700 of his readings mentioned Atlantis at least one time. But many of his readings were life readings that people had about their past lives, and he gave enormous amounts of detail about Atlantis. Okay. So one of the most interesting things that he gave in his readings was a much broader history of the world and of our history. How many of you maybe remember when you were in school, you got the lecture that the cradle of civilization was what? Mesopotamia in 4000 BC. And if you've been attending these conferences for very long, that makes that old piece of information pretty laughable, doesn't it? And of course we know that even mainstream archaeology now has gone way past 4000 BC. But according to Edgar Cayce and other wisdom traditions and other psychic material, we know that there was really history that goes much further back. In the Cayce story, he tells us that the first root race, as he calls it, and this is very similar to the idea that comes out of Blavatsky and those guys, we were really ethereal spiritual beings in about 12 million BC. There was a second root race in Lemuria about 10 million BC. The third root race is the one we're going to be concerned about. And he said actually Atlantis had residents as early as 200,000 BC. Now there's nothing in mainstream archaeology that follows that, but he says that they met their demise around 10,000 BC, which is around the same time Plato identifies their final destruction. And that's really what we've keyed in on our research. He also says sometime maybe 12,000 BC, maybe 20,000 BC, there's a lot of question in the readings, that there was a fourth root race, that there was some other genetic change in humankind, and that we are actually in a period now where we may be moving into a fifth root race. All right, just a little background. This is very much just a thumbnail sketch of Edgar Cayce's story. It's a huge story. someone sent me this cartoon. I thought, well, at least the mainstream is keeping up with the idea of Atlantis. So your flood control bill didn't make it out of the committee. Well, it's not the end of the world. Or is it? So let's talk about Cayce's story of the destruction of Atlantis. He said there were 3 destructions. One of them, he said, occurred in about 50,000 BC. There were about 21 readings that reference this. And he said that in 50,000 BC there were a lot of large animals, and there was an effort to try to annihilate them, to get rid of them. And in the process of that, they created some sort of an explosion or some sort of environmental upheaval that created a pole shift. Now, Atlantis was still existed. Instead of being one continent, it became 5 islands at that point. In 28,000 BC, and there were 52 readings that related to this time frame, he said somebody was in charge of this power tool that they called the firestone. Some people think it was a quartz crystal of some sort, but he doesn't really describe it in enough detail for us to know exactly what it was. But some people believe it was something like a laser, that it may have been used in a similar way, because he talked about it being used for surgery. He talked about it being used to power submarines, airplanes, really quite a technology. But in 20,000 BC, somebody got in there and tuned it up too high, and it created another destruction for Atlantis. But the one we're most concerned about in our explorations is the 10,000 BC destruction. And that's where you get most of the Edgar Cayce readings. There were 352 readings that talked about some sort of catastrophe that happened in 10,000 BC. And we don't know what it was. We don't know if it was a comet, a tsunami, whether it was global warming or an earthquake. If you were watching the Indonesia tsunami, in 2004, you realize how destructive that kind of a force is, that it could just about wiped out all sign of civilization. But what we know from the Cayce readings is that there was some kind of warning. Whatever this thing was, they knew it was about to happen. And they knew it, so they decided that in order to maintain a record of their civilization, that they would create these 3 halls of records. And we're going to talk about those. And these halls of records, what are in those records? Well, they wanted to, first of all, preserve their history. And in the readings, it says that in these halls of records are tablets, and that there'll be 32 of these tablets or plates that are found. They also talk about that it's going to be a little bit difficult to tell what those tablets say. They're going to be in Egyptian, early Egyptian, but they're also going to have some Atlantean language in them. So it's going to take a little while for us to translate and know what they mean. So what kinds of things are in the hall or in the place where the records are? Well, it's not just the tablets. It's also, information about pyramid building, the firestone. There'll be information about how it was constructed and what it was. There'll be musical instruments, linens, ancient tools, things about lost arts, and so forth. Even some unleavened bread, supposedly. I'm sure that'll be delicious by that time. But then, of course, what everybody wants to know is, when will the records be found? What did Edgar Cayce have to say about that? Well, he seems to indicate that it's a time when there's some sort of change that occurs in the earth. And a lot of people read these readings back in the 60s and 70s and actually created communes and went and sort of did all their survival work, and were ready between 58 and 98 for some major change to happen where there'd be some kind of catastrophe, and of course it didn't happen. However, we do know that global warming is, at least some of us believe that there's such a thing as global warming, and that those are earth changes that he's talking about here. Upheavals, shifting of the poles. We know that we're having a great melting at the poles. We do know that the climate is changing in a lot of ways. So one of the things that you hear in the Cayce readings is that the future is not set. So even though he made this prediction, it doesn't mean that these particular dates are going to be accurate. He says that we have the ability to make a change through our own choices as to what's going to happen in the future. So it looks like he was just a little bit off. We're probably in this period now, or at least the beginnings of it. So he also says that it won't be entered until the time has been fulfilled, that the changes must be active. He says that they may also not be entered until there's an understanding and until the fifth root race begins. Well, when you look in the Cayce material for what the heck is the fifth root race, what he tells you is that it's, rather than so much a physical change among human beings, it's a consciousness change. And if you look at just what's happening with technology, for example, consciousness is changing. We were just talking about the other day how short our attention span has become, how much information we have to take in every day, and how much we multitask, and we're getting lots of bits of information from so many sources. Things seem to be moving faster and faster and faster. And some people believe that may be a sign of the fifth root race, that it's actually a change in consciousness, maybe a change in our neuroscience or neurology. Okay, but then the third thing he says is that the records will be opened when there is a seeking within the inner self for a knowledge of the close relationships with the creative forces. In other words, when we're doing that spiritual search, when people all over the world are doing more of a spiritual search. And I think I see that around the world too at the moment. We see really terrible things around the world, but you also see people who truly are seekers for their connection with that deeper self and with that divine self. So back again to the circle. So the fifth root race, one more time, is that consciousness shift. All right, so it's very possible we're in the era when the Hall of Records is going to be found. So where is the Hall of Records? Where are the Hall of Records? Well, he said they were put in 3 different places. One is in the Yucatan, and one is in the Bahamas and Bimini, and that's where we've spent a lot of time. We have been to the area of Piedras Negras in Guatemala, where he seems to give clues that that's where he put one of the Hall of Records, or where they put one of the Hall of Records. And there's also one in Egypt. And there's been a lot of work by the ARE, by the Edgar Cayce organization, to try to find the one in Egypt. And at the end of this talk, I'm going to tell you the latest in that direction. But let's start with the Yucatan, and I'm going to give you, again, just really a thumbnail on this one, because the talk is really going to be about the Bahamas. But what he said is that the records were in the Aryan or Yucatan land, where the temple there is overshadowing same. Well, he also says, and this is where we were able to pinpoint the site, he said the records that were carried to the Yucatan in the America were those stones that they know so little about during the last few months are being uncovered. And in another reading, he talks about it's where the University of Pennsylvania was excavating at that particular time, and this was 1933. So in the summer and spring of 1933, the only place that the University of Pennsylvania was excavating was a site, a Mayan site, classic Mayan site called Piedras Negras in Guatemala. And some people say, well, that's not the Yucatan. This peninsula here is the Yucatan of Mexico, and that's true. But this is right where that peninsula connects to the bigger part of the continent. So you could quibble about whether or not that's the Yucatan. What's interesting is that Piedras Negras is on a river that attaches to the Gulf, which is an important part of the Yucatan as well. So we visited there in 2004. It's not a very friendly place to visit even then, and it's certainly not now. This is a map of Piedras Negras, and you can see there are temples all over. Now this is the classic Maya era, which probably only goes back to, the best they can find is a couple of locations that might be about 500 BC, but most of them are AD, early first millennia AD. This is just one of the features that right on the river called the sacrificial stone. I'll go through these pretty fast. This is one of the large temple complexes called the Acropolis in Piedras Negras. And it actually looks pretty good right now. When we were there, it was mostly jungle. We did find and this is one of my favorite temples. It has these two masks on it, jaguar masks. But near this temple, we found a place, one of our guides showed us a place where you could put your hand in an area that had been dug by the Brigham Young University just a few years prior, and they were trying to dig under the temple to find what they hoped was a sarcophagus down there, but the temples there were built on top of older temples, and there's rubble put in between, and they never could get it made stable enough and safe enough to go down, but you could still see the opening, and we put our hand in. And if you've ever been in Central America, especially this was May of 2004, it's hot. And you got water streaming down, and you're like you're in a steam bath. And we put our hand in the hole, and here's this cool breeze coming out of the hole. And of course, what does that mean? It means it's attached to something underground, a cave, some sort of cavern system underground. We know that almost all of the Mayan sites had underground caverns. A lot of times the priests would use them to show up from one temple to another. They'd pop up as if by magic from one area to another. And one of the interesting things about Piedras Negras is just Spanish for black rocks, because that's the type of rock that's in that area. But the Maya name for Piedras Negras is Yoquib, which is interesting because it means great entrance. And of course, what's it a great entrance to? It's one of many Mayan sites along that river, nothing special. You're not entering anything in particular that we could tell. Some people believe, the archaeologists say it's about the largest cenote in all of Central America, which is located there. But that doesn't seem right. Why would you go to this particular place to go into the cenote? Well, maybe to go into the underworld, which is what they believed about cenotes. But this cenote is not one that you can easily enter. It's actually a huge hole in the ground. So we wonder if this Mayan name comes from a tradition that this was an entrance possibly to the Hall of Records. Okay, so the second place Cayce identifies as a location of a Hall of Records is in the Bahamas, in Bimini. He says the one in the Atlantean land that sank, that will rise and is rising again. And that is the area of the Bahamas, and Cuba is where he considered the Atlantean continent to have been. He even mentions Bimini specifically. He says, in the sunken portions of Atlantis or Poseidia, where a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater. And we can tell you there's lots of slime under that seawater, lots of coral near what is known as Bimini off the coast of Florida. So just for a little geography here, this is Florida. This is around Miami area, and Bimini is right about here. This is Cuba. And if you'll notice, the brownish areas are where you have land above the water. This light blue area here is called the Great Bahama Bank, and it actually was above the sea level in 10,000 BC. This would have been an entire island, all of this area, and over here in the top part as well. All right, so what's been going on at ARE, in the Edgar Cayce ARE with Atlantis research rather. All right. So when you're going to do research to try to find Atlantis in Bimini, what are you going to look for? The lost continent of Atlantis. And of course you think, well, we're going to find a sign there that says Atlantis right here. No, probably not. What is going to be left after 10,000 years? And what's going to be left underwater after 10,000 years? Well, the best you can hope for would be the remains of buildings. Stone will usually last underwater. You have a problem with it gaining coral debris, but in some places, if it's been able to be under the sand for a long period of time, you might be able to find something that can appear to be a building. And the Cayce readings say there are some protruding portions within the Bahamas that must at one time or another been a portion of Atlantis. He talks about the British West Indies or Bahamas. It may be seen in the present. And he recommended that particularly that we look in Bimini and the Gulf Stream region through this vicinity. And this site that I'm going to show you, Brown's Ruins, is around the Gulf Stream. And he says these may even yet be determined. So there is something that could be found, is what he's saying. So once again, here's our map. This is Bimini, this is Miami, this is the Gulf Stream, all through here. All of this white part, or I'm sorry, light blue part, is the Great Bahama Bank, and you can see what a line this is along here, that all of a sudden it gets extremely deep. And this water right through here moves extremely fast. All right, so here's where you can see it a little bit better. All right, so what kinds of things have been found at Bimini? Well, probably most of you are familiar with the Bimini Road, what has been called the Bimini Road. We don't believe it's a road, we believe it's a breakwater, ancient harbor. And this little bitty white dot up here is a boat. So I'll show you the boat a little bit closer. But this is Bimini Island here. This is a area that we discovered with Bill Donato back in 2009 or 2010, I believe. And it seems to be another area of these huge, flat, rectangular stones, just like you see at the Bimini Road. So here's the Paradise Point Pier, a little bit closer, and I don't know if you can see very well on here, but all of these are just huge rectangular rocks that are set on the seafloor. And this is about 15 feet in depth. What I thought was interesting, this is an aerial view of a harbor in Corinth, Greece, that was built in about 600 BC. This is what remains of it. But you can see, again, all of these rectangular rocks. It's a little bit blurry, but just to give you an idea. And they find these ancient harbors all over the Mediterranean. Many of them are Phoenician, go back even further than 600 BC. So this is a close-up of the Paradise Point Pier, which looks very much like the Bimini Road. One of the things we found that we thought was very telling was an anchor stone on the Paradise Point Pier. And you see this stone, this is what it looked like when we ran into it. And then we pulled it up, and you can see rope grooves on each side and a hole drilled. And you think, well, why do you think that's an anchor? Well, in the harbors in the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians made very similar anchors. And these are examples. All right, so once more, the Bimini Road. This is a boat. The Bimini Road is an inverted J. We're getting a little closer to it. You can see this was a very clear day, water-wise, so you can see through. And if you look really closely, you can see Greg swimming down here. I'm up in the helicopter. I think I see his mustache in there somewhere. But this is what we think it looked like back in 6000 BC. When you look at sea levels, this is about, again, 10 to 15 feet. And in 10,000 BC, it would not have been appropriate for that to have been a breakwater, which is we're looking for something in 10,000 BC to find something that was there before the final destruction of Atlantis. But what was there in 6000 BC? Well, according to the archaeologists, if you ask look at the history of the Bahamas, they tell you there was no one in the Bahamas before 500 AD. Well, that makes no sense, and I'll tell you why. The water level was much higher. The distance right now between Miami at Florida and Bimini is 50 miles. We know that there were people who came over to Andros in the Bahamas in the 1800s to escape the slave problems that were going on in the United States, and they came over in canoes. We know that they could have made that journey in canoes. So why is there no evidence in the Bahamas before 500 AD of any sort of Native American presence? And we believe that the reason is that there were probably regular cyclic catastrophes, maybe hurricanes, maybe tsunamis, but something that just not only got rid of the people, but got rid of any sign of the people. And again, if you look back at the Indonesian tsunami, you can see how terribly destructive that sort of force can be. So this is a breakwater. We were watching one of the channels, I guess History Channel, a few years ago, and we saw these divers, and it looked like they were on the Bimini Road. We saw the rectangular rocks and so forth that looked just like what we see when we dive on the Bimini Road. And we watched for a little while. We wondered, who's looking at the Bimini Road now? And all of a sudden, the announcer came on. They were in the Mediterranean looking at ancient Phoenician harbors. All right. So again, we're looking for underwater building remains. We want to go older than 6,000 BC. So we've been looking since about 2003. We'd go a couple times a year. Now, prior to our going in 2003, there have been several expeditions sent by ARE, by the Edgar Cayce organization, and one of those expeditions had deep divers who were able to go to the 300-foot depth off of Bimini, way out, and what they believe that they found were these dome-shaped areas. You can't see it real well. Of course, it's beyond the kind of diving that Greg and I could do. We're just amateur divers. When we go 100 feet, we've really pushed the limit. But you can see this is an area that's raised. It's got so much coral on it. You'd have to really do a major excavation to be able to tell if there was anything man-made. There's no sign that we know of stones. They do believe that some of these areas that are kind of smooth through here look like paths, but it's really a hard area to do much further research. All right. But then there is an area at 90 to 100 feet that we think is really interesting, that has some rectangular formations that are extremely important. And somebody said earlier, we talked about the smoking gun, and I think they said it was the smoking, I can't remember what the word they used. Anyway, the 10,000 BC shoreline would have been at the 90 to 100 foot level. So if we can find buildings at the 90 to 100 foot depth, we may have found evidence of Atlantis. So this again is Bimini. These rectangles are further out to sea beyond the Bimini Road. In 2006, ARE funded a project for Bill Donato, a longtime ARE researcher, to do side-scan sonar. And of course, to most of us, this looks like just a bunch of blobs on a gray screen. But to the people who do this, they went up and down all through that area, and they only report something that they know is not normal. So when they see just regular things that they would expect to see, and this is a company that does this all the time. They know what the seafloor looks like. This is an area they said was an anomaly, was something that they had not seen before. And what was interesting is that these were regularly placed rectangles. And here's a drawing roughly of what they might look like. Well, that's not what coral normally does. Here's what we think they might have been in 10,000 BC, right along the shoreline. Possibly storage units, possibly homes. This is what it looks like now. This is the first dive. Our Bahamian colleague, Esley Brown, dove on the coral formations at 90 feet. And this was a picture that we took with a drop camera. And then in 2009, we went back and took some others. Now, we have done diving on this, and when you get up close to it, it looks like just lava blobs, really and truly. However, they do seem to form squares. And what I thought was especially interesting with the drop camera, and then we also saw this when we dove, is that these are separated by really flat areas. It's like you get these humps, and then every so often there's a flat area, and then there's another hump. And in between, in these flat areas, oftentimes you would find these rectangular areas that all around in perfect right angles, you'd find these little things growing that were coral that looked like mushrooms. And they would grow in the shape of a rectangle. Well, those coral buds need some kind of stone to attach to begin with. And so this is stone that's under the sand in between these particular clumps of what we think is stone. So again, this is what we think it looks like. Now what would need to happen at that site is that you'd need to have something to blow the sand off, and hopefully you might find some stone that has never been above the sea, or never been above the sand. Because once it gets above the sand, the coral begins to attach to it, and think about this is 12,000 years ago. Over that long a period of time, the coral eventually dissolves the stone, and the stone actually becomes in that coral shape, and it doesn't really look like a stone anymore. So we're hoping to find someday there'll be someone who can go in and blow all the sand off and see if there are maybe some stones and some rectangular formations that have not been above the sand, so that they did not have any coral on them. One of our drawbacks too is that we can't remove the coral. That's against the law in the Bahamas, so you can't just go and try to scrape the coral off. And the other problem with that site is that the current, the Gulf Stream current, begins to form at about the 90, 100 foot level, and it's extremely hard to dive on. It's certainly the limit for Greg and I. We can only dive to 100 feet, and if we do, we can only stay about 20 minutes. All right, so the next thing we found was columns and walls at the 15 to 20 foot depth. And they were quite interesting. Actually, our Bahamian colleagues, Esley and Krista Brown, found them. And they are pretty compelling. You can see this looks like a wall here, and this is just limestone, which is what you find all over the Bahamas. Interesting thing is 2 years later, it's been, all the sand has been blown back onto it. There have been, as hurricanes come through, as storms come through. And that's the interesting thing. The hurricanes that come through will open up things and they'll close things. Now there was enough interest in that particular site that there was a sampling done of what we called the columns, and they were determined to be anywhere from 21 to 20,000 BC. And limestone, as you know, can be dated because it does have organic matter in it. Doesn't mean that it was placed there at this time frame, but we at least know that particular piece of limestone is that old. So still, doesn't prove anything. And I'm showing you the old research that we've done to show you how truly magnificent the new research is. So the next thing we decided to do, though, before I get to the really great research, is we decided to look on the Great Bahama Bank. So in 2008, we did an aerial survey. We started in Fort Lauderdale, went all the way over Andros, and came over this area of the Great Bahama Bank. And what we were looking for were the black spots that we were seeing from the air anytime that we were flying over. And what those black spots are is where seagrass is growing on some sort of stone. So again, we're looking for building stones. We figure, okay, if this was Atlantis in 10,000 BC, it was above the water line, there'll be houses, or maybe there'll be some remnant of houses, and maybe some of these black spots that you see all over the place could possibly be the remnants of a building. This was one that we saw that we thought was interesting. Later, what we would do is we would fly over, get as close as we could over it, do the GPS. Actually, we used the GPS of the plane. We'd write them down very quickly, take pictures so we know kind of what the formation was that we were looking for. And then we'd come back on a boat later and try to locate them in the sea. And it was, thanks to our Bahamian colleagues, it wasn't as difficult as it might seem. So this is one that we had identified from the air. We came back to it, and what was interesting is that it does have a rise in the middle. It has a white line around the edge, but we still did not see any particular stones in it. So just another example. This is one that looks like it has an eye in it. It's like almost like a fish. There's really some odd shapes. So we did this for several years, not finding much of anything, but this is where we would go then on the boat and relocate the area and go in and snorkel and check it out to see if we see anything. And occasionally we'd find shipwreck. In fact, we found quite a few shipwrecks. We weren't interested in them, so we moved on. But we did not find anything that we really felt like was a building remains. All right. Then comes August of 2011. We were going to finish up the last of the spots. We were going to go back and to get on a boat and follow through with the last of our GPS. And it's about 2 days, or actually the day before we were going to leave to go back down to Bimini. And we get a call from our friends Esley and Krista Brown, our colleagues, and they're super excited. Now, if you know them, you know, well, wait a minute, they're really laid back people, and they kept saying, we're going to send you some pictures, turn your computer on, we're going to send you some pictures. We said, well, don't worry about it, we're going to come late, we're going to be here in just 2 days, you know, you can show it to us then. No, we got to show it to you now. They said, we've been on a fishing trip, and it's an area that we've been to before, and we've never seen this before. It's a great fishing spot, but it just so happened that day, the water was very clear, and that the current was just right so that they could swim down into it. And they'd also been going with us on all of these trips, and they knew what it was we were looking for. And they said, we found what you're looking for. And what they'd found was something that they named, and rightfully so, since they located it, Brown's Ruins. So these are the pictures they sent us. And we could see this was unlike anything we had seen before. And this particular one was especially important to us. They said, we found columns. We said, oh, you didn't find columns. And sure enough, when the pictures came through, you see these old pieces, and you can see the fluting along the sides. There you go. I think you can see the fluting okay on your copy of it. That's unlike anything we have ever seen before. Now, if you know anything about how columns were made in the ancient times, you know, they weren't just one great big long piece, they were chunks, right? Pieces and chunks. And that's what we may have here. Now, this particular area is about 10 feet deep, 10 to 15 feet deep, but the pile of rocks comes up to where it's almost 6 feet above, depending on where the tide is, 6 feet above the water, or below the water. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what fluting is, this is the Temple of Delphi. And you can see what remains of these are also kind of chunked off there at the top, not unlike what we're seeing. And again, here's the fluting features. So after going through all of those black spots all over the Great Bahama Bank, we could see why they were so excited and why they felt like they needed to send us those pictures right away. Well, just like almost every site that we've come to, there's always something that makes it a little bit difficult. And in this particular site, you can only dive on it for about 90 minutes, twice a day. It's right on the edge of the Great Bahama Bank and the Gulf Stream, and the water comes across there when the tides change so powerfully. You know, I thought they were exaggerating till I stayed a little bit too long past the 90 minutes the first time, and I felt the power of that current go through. It's really something. But the good part about that particular current is that it has kept coral from growing on this particular site. So you've got water that washes across twice a day, every day, or every 24 hours. So our goals in 2012 were measure the site, measure individual stones, do sampling and analysis. What are these stones made of? So we measured the site. And this is basically what it looks like from the boat. And let's see if my video is going to work here. So we looked down on it for the first time. And you can see some of the stones through the water. They're pretty close to the top of the surface. They're about 6 feet. Okay. So this is a rough map. We could map the sides of it. We think it's about 535 feet from east to west and about 140 to 160 feet from north to south. It's a huge site. When you get down and dive on it, you see that it's got a tremendous amount of really dense, huge stones in this area. And then more stones up in the lighter brown area that are kind of scattered. You can see some sand between them, but this begins to stack up. This actually becomes almost like a hill. Okay, and now I'm going to take you on a little swimming voyage, and you don't even have to get wet. This is an overview of the site. We're going to start at a particular feature. You know, when you see so many stones, it's hard to identify where you are when you're diving, so we named some of the stones. This one we call the beam. There's one that we call the refrigerator, which is the largest one. And then you'll see as Esley Brown is swimming along that you'll follow a shark, and the shark will take you, it's just an earth shark. The shark will take you through the site. Got it. Oh. Sorry about that. At home, the writing wasn't on it, so you're not going to be able to see it quite as well. So this is Esley Brown swimming over the site, just to give you an idea. And this is one of those rounded stones. It looks like a, yeah, you can also see this one is rounded. Lots of these stones appear to be, this is one of the pillars with the fluting. Okay, and that's what we call the refrigerator stone right here. It's the size of a refrigerator. We'll show you the measurements in a minute. But you can see the density. There we go, and there's the shark has shown up. And then I kind of get focused on him as I'm moving the camera. But the great thing is that you can begin to see how many stones there are. This is a huge site. And every so often you can see the edge up here where it goes off to the sand. Now, after spending a couple of years looking at the Great Bahama Bank, looking for something, you know, just a fraction of this amount of stone, we were overwhelmed. You can see huge stones. All of these, look at these flat rectangular stones. And they do seem like they've been pushed down. Okay, this is the edge over here where it becomes mostly sand. You can see where we came back from it. Okay, just an idea of what it looks like. So this is an overview of where we just went on the dive. We started at the beam stone, went to the double columns, the refrigerator, and then sort of into the middle of the site. So we decided we needed to measure the stones. We picked 4 iconic stones. We named them the refrigerator. This is the refrigerator, because that's how large it was. The beam, this one is the beam. The double fluted columns, and this one of the double fluted, we call this one the bullet because it was sort of bullet shaped, and the other one the larger rounded column. This just gives you an idea of roughly where they are, and they're all kind of in one particular area. Remember, we only have 90 minutes to go in and do this. Okay, so we determined that the refrigerator stone was about 8 feet by almost 4 feet, 3 feet 3 inches. Its thickness was 1 foot. The beam was 2 feet by 8 feet. The double fluted columns, the bullet and the larger rounded, were 2 feet by 1 foot, and the large rounded was 1 foot by 4 feet. And there's a side view of it. And you can really see in that side view, again, well, I can see it better on my screen than you guys can, but again, you can really see the fluting through here. That's a really unusual feature. All right, so what really got exciting is that we sampled the stones to see what they were. And the nice thing is it's not an archaeological site until it is an archaeological site. That's kind of the paradox. So we know now it is an archaeological site. So we sampled all 4 of those particular rocks that I just showed you, and we found out, we sent them off to be analyzed. The rock type is Biotite-Quartz schist. You have to say schist very carefully. And what is schist? Okay, it has a lot of different things in it, and there's lots of different kinds of schist. This particular one is called a Biotite-Quartz schist. It had biotite, feldspar, quartz, chlorite, garnet. It's a metamorphic rock, which means it was what? Created by pressure. It commonly contains all of these particular minerals, including sometimes magnetite, which I thought was interesting. So where do you get that? Is there any schist, I have to say it carefully, in Bimini? No, there's not. There's not any in the Bahamas. The closest source is Jamaica, but it's a quarry that's way up at the top of a mountain, and there's no evidence that anyone has done any great quarrying there. Hispaniola in the Dominican Republic has some that matches this particular type of schist. There's some in Maine and some in England. So maybe you guys brought it over. It's a long way for an awful lot of stone. And one of the things we realized is that with this type of stone, a stone the size of the refrigerator is multi-tons. So if you're carrying that kind of a load over to the Bahamas, you're carrying it over for a really important reason. Now, this gives you an idea. Here's Brown's Ruins over here, here's Jamaica, here's Hispaniola. That's even a long distance to be carrying it, but it's not likely it came from those sources. So we talked to a professor of geology in Miami. He said, the blocks seem large, and he says they do seem to be quarried for a particular purpose. Most intriguing. And he goes on to say that yeah, they only occur in Jamaica, maybe Hispaniola, but not likely. He says maybe the Appalachians or France or Spain, but he said there's not a lot of it around in the Caribbean islands. Somebody's brought it in. He said, my original thought is that maybe those stones were used for ballast. But then he realized they were a little bit large for that, right? And his final statement is, sorry, I'm stumped. He has no idea why it's there. So we wanted to know, well, how is schist usually used? Well, guess what it's used for? Buildings. They used it in Central Park in a building. They used it as long ago as 5 to 17,000 or 1700 BC in Portugal. It was used in Greece, the ancient Temple of Pelion. They've found it in use as far back as 10,000 BC by the Neolithics in Norway. They found it in Egypt. It was a common stone to use to make objects. This mysterious object that we found as we were looking for things was the schist disc. You really had to say that carefully. Was discovered in Saqqara. No, they really don't know what it is, but they think they call it an incense burner. Looks kind of UFO-y, doesn't it? So the question is, when and how did these stones get here? Was it cargo from a shipwreck? So maybe it wasn't ballast, but maybe it was cargo. All right, well, that's a long way to come to be carrying, and it's an awful shallow area to be bringing a ship through. Well, we did find some nails, and this is a picture of Esley Brown down here pulling up some nails, and this is what we pulled up, some old square nails and some pieces of some sort of a shipwreck has occurred on that pile of rocks. But the thing is that the pile of rocks was so far away from where you could see land, that I'm sure it surprised people. I wouldn't be surprised if several ships have hit it. And sure enough, in 1906, there's a report of the ship called the Dixon Rice that hit a sunken reef exactly in this area. And this is the kind of ship that would have been, that the Dixon Rice was. It's a Ballantine ship. The draft is only 12 to 18 feet. Well, that surely would have hit this pile of rocks, no problems. And it was capable of carrying 200 to 350 tons of cargo. So did the Dixon Rice have this kind of cargo? Nope, no cargo, only passengers. All 9 passengers were saved. We have a story all about their being saved, and there was no ballast stones. Those would be too big to be ballast stones anyway, but they used sand for ballast. So it has to be, it was there in 1906 because more than likely that's what they hit was the Browns ruins. So is it the remains of an ancient building? So what would be remaining after 10,000 years? When this would have been above water probably in 3 to 6,000 BC. But what would be remaining in that length of time? Well, here's what happens to buildings, of course, over a long period of time. This is the Temple of Delphi, and it's, I'm sure, been carefully reconstructed, but look at the condition of the stones all around. They're pieces. Somebody's gotten them organized and is trying to put it back together. These are some ruins of an old temple, and you see these flat stones, which we also see in Brown's ruins. So here's a flat area of flat stones in the center. So are there any tool marks? Well, there's one in particular that we noticed. Could be where a ship scratched across it, but it also appears to be a deliberate mark of some kind, very straight. And near it is also a mark across this stone right here, and I think this is another one of my videos. There we go. So this is Krista Brown showing the mark all the way up this particular stone. So there's a groove all the way up. And it's a wide groove, if you can see. And here's the groove we just saw down here below it. So the two seem to relate to each other. So how about wedge stones? Did it look like any of the stones have been placed and maybe there might be wedge stones underneath it? Yes, there were, as a matter of fact. All right, so again, rough map of Brown's ruins. So here's the beam, the double columns, the refrigerator that we showed earlier. The tool mark stones are over here. The wedge stones are up here in that particular area. So all of this is pretty spread out. We find lots of unusually shaped stones. And of course, the one we call the bullet, which is interestingly between 2011 and 2012. It must have been done by the current, because as far as we know, there weren't people there. This originally was right next to this stone, but it's been pushed away from it, and that could be the current. And if that's true, then it means that these particular stones could be moving slightly from their original positions just by that incredible current that comes through there twice a day. All right, so this is the beam stone. This stone appears to be at a right angle, to have been cut at a right angle. Another one with a right angle cut. And then this one with a notch. Remember, if these are 10,000 or even 6,000 years old, they've been under the water a long time. This is a triangular shaped stone. And lots of these really rounded stones where they are rounded toward the end. This one's really interesting. It's been smooth, almost like a tombstone. And there's a close-up of it. Another one that's obviously been carved. And a close-up of it. Lots of stones that are fully rounded that could possibly be columns. So these here, and let's see. Actually, all three of these, when you dive on them, you can see are rounded. You can see the ends of these. You see how rounded this particular stone is as well. They're squared off blocks. And again, our two column stones. Okay, another factor is that they're large stones that are piled so densely. And remember, there's no stone like this anywhere in the Bahamas. This is not fallen from an island, or as far as we know, not from a ship. I want to give you a sense of the real size of this. Now this one gives you an idea. You can see how everything's kind of built up. It's a big pile of stones so that it actually has some height to it at the top. But look how huge these rectangular stones are. And they're laid off to the side, just like there'd been some kind of catastrophe. These are the flat stones again. This one I thought was interesting. You can see where this stone is up higher and she's starting to go downhill. Same way here, you can see the side of the pile as he's diving down. So, the Bahamas Hall of Records, as Edgar Cayce says, it may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater near what is known as Bimini, and this is very near Bimini. We think it's probably the best example of an underwater building that we have found so far. And this is a really poor artistic but possible reconstruction of Brown's ruins. Okay, so what are our plans for the future? Well, we really need to do a more detailed mapping of Brown's ruins. We need to sample the stones for analysis in a broader area. We were mostly on one side, but every one of those samples was the exact same type of stone, and we believe the whole site is the same type of schist. We need to do more shipwreck research and ideally a side scan sonar, and then you can carbon date coral, and it'd be interesting to see how old that coral is. See if we can get any dates. All right, so remember there were three places that Edgar Cayce said the Hall of Records were placed. One was the Yucatan, one was the Bahamas, and the third one was Egypt. And so you're probably familiar through Baval's work and Hancock's work about what ARE has done through the years, what the Edgar Cayce organization has done looking for the Hall of Records really since the 50s. Edgar Cayce's son, Hugh Lynn, was very interested in this, and he's the one who really formed a relationship with Zahi Hawass back in those days, helped him get through school, and Mark Lehner was a member of ARE for many, many years. The Egyptian Hall of Records, according to the Cayce readings, he gives you some pretty specific stuff. He says it's from the chambers of the way between the Sphinx, so the Sphinx is a real important piece of this, and the Pyramid of Records. The Pyramid of Records, we think, is a pyramid that may be underground somewhere that holds the Hall of Records. And this is just a look at the whole Giza Plateau. He says, for the later pyramids are those yet not uncovered that have been spoken of between the Sphinx, or the mystery, he calls the Sphinx the mystery, and the Nile, or the river. So the Nile used to run, here's the Sphinx, the Nile used to run where you see all of this city over here. It's now further east. But this is the Sphinx, this is the Great Pyramid, this is the Second Pyramid, and so the river used to run through here, and he talks about the Sphinx right paw, which would be over on this side. This would be a side of interest. So in this position, as the sun rises, let's see, which may not be entered, he's talking about the Hall of Records, from the connecting chambers from the Sphinx paw, the right paw, until the time has been fulfilled. Well, maybe it has been fulfilled, maybe it hasn't. We've been wondering if it has not been fulfilled because we found that the doors were shutting in all three places. If you know very much about what's going on in Guatemala, you know their government is pretty much falling apart. It was already a pretty dangerous area when we went in 2004. And we could see on the Usumacinta River every day, 2 or 3 times a day, you'd see a boatload of people go by with backpacks. And we were assuming they were primarily immigrants coming up to the United States. Well, now we know that there were also, and continues to be, a lot of drug movement along that river and then up through Mexico and into the United States. And as the government is losing control, it's become an even more difficult area to enter. The Bahamas, which I didn't mention, the reason we have not done any further research on Brown's ruins is shortly after we stopped, or shortly after we found Brown's ruins, we called our friend who was an archaeologist who had been going with us on some of our expeditions when we needed a permit, and said, we need you to come with us. We found this incredible site. And he said, okay, let me just renew my archaeological permit. And he goes to do the renewal, and time goes by and time goes by, and finally he finds out that they've put a moratorium on all the permits. Everybody's permits is suspended. He's had one for 25 years. So we go in a little bit deeper and we find out that there was a group that had come in and found a shipwreck, and they'd had their permit, but when they when they found something, they took it back and they didn't give the portion to the Bahamas that they were supposed to give. Well, when we first started looking in the Bahamas, we were accused of looking for gold. We would tell people we were looking for Atlantis, and they'd say, yeah, right. What are you really looking for? And we would have to say, no, we're really looking, have you heard of Edgar Cayce? And go through the whole story, and they'd still just kind of shake their head. Because there were a lot of people who would go and find these shipwrecks that we did find evidence of, and never tell the Bahamian government what they were doing. So apparently somebody got caught, and that put a stop to everything, and they redid all of their regulations, and now their regulations are so tight. It's amazing. I think you have to get a permit for about a 1 mile square area, and you have to tell them in advance. You have to get permission to go to that particular area where we used to go globally and check the whole Great Bahama Bank. That wouldn't work anymore. You have to have an underwater Bahamian archaeologist. Well, there's very few underwater archaeologists, period, and there's only one Bahamian underwater archaeologist that we're aware of. You have to have a regular archaeologist, and so on and so forth, so that it's really ponderous to do any kind of archaeological exploration. So it's going to take a bigger group than we are to do it. So Egypt. So things are perking along in Egypt. And in fact, it was perking along partly because of Andrew Collins and because of Nigel. Their work with the Cygnus mystery, and that Deneb marked the entrance to a cave, the entrance to the Tomb of the Birds, and that there is a cave system that runs really all across from the Tomb of the Birds all the way over to the Sphinx, to the exact area that Edgar Cayce talked about that contained the Hall of Records. And about the time that was really getting going, and here's a picture of Andrew. You've probably seen this through the years. I love this picture. This is Andrew. Tells you this is the great, right after you go through the tomb into the first large entrance, and then you go down through here into the really, really tricky areas where all the bat and the guano is, and the really dangerous area. But it tells you there's an incredible underground system there in Giza. About the time this got going, of course, Zahi was not willing to admit that it even existed for a while, but Nigel and Andrew were persistent with it. But then we had the Egypt Spring and the uprising and the change in the government. And the next government that took over really did not want to do any kind of excavations. Then they got rid of Zahi. Zahi got in trouble because he was so close to Mubarak. You all are probably more familiar with all of that than I am, and it just seemed like that Egypt was shut down. So here's the third Hall of Records. And so our thinking at the Edgar Cayce organization was that, okay, the time is not right. The world's not ready for the information. So the most recent thing that's happened, though, is that now that there's a military government, they realize that these discoveries were part of what was bringing in a lot of the tourist the tours and the tourists into Egypt. So they have seen the light that they need to allow more excavations to go on, and if for no other reason but to bring in more income. So even though they really want to focus mostly on Muslim and Islamic archaeology, they are willing for a consortium to get together, and there's a company called Scan Pyramids that was commissioned in 2015 to actually do what I call an X-ray of the Great Pyramid, and it involves 3 universities from Canada, Japan, and France, and they're actually using 3 different types of non-invasive, so they're not doing any drilling, they're not doing anything that's going to harm the monuments, but they're doing thermography, 3D simulation, and muon radiography imaging, so like an X-ray. And what they've found is pretty exciting. They found 2 new caverns, 2 new anomalies. One on the east side, which is here, if you remember the Sphinx is over in this direction, and one on the north side where the entrance is. So the first hot spot they found was on the east wall. It's down at the bottom, and it's kind of off almost toward the north side. This is what it looks like without the thermography on it, but this is what the hot spot looks like. And they believe there's some kind of cavern and maybe passageway through there. There's Zahi standing next to it. Now, what's Zahi got to do with it? Well, he's no longer, of course, the director of the Giza Plateau, but they have asked him to come and be a part of this particular expedition, even though he's not over it, but he's sort of the public face of it, because they realize he has so many people who know who he is, and he knows how to get people excited about new discoveries, and they know that they need to bring people's interest back to Egypt to get people to come. So he's there in the picture, and also Mark Lehner, who was his assistant, has also been brought into this project. But it's really being done by Scan Pyramids. All right, then the north side, and this is the original, the ancient original entrance. This is not the one that tourists go through. There's a better picture here. So this is the original ancient entrance, and this is the one that we go through as tourists. And you can see, this really gives you an idea, if you haven't been there, what a large monument this is. And the interesting thing, and I've got this information from John Van Auken, who is an ARE director at ARE, and he also oversees our connection to Egypt. And he's been in touch with Zahi and has a good relationship with him, so he's getting this information. But the glyph that's at the top of the ancient entrance symbolizes horizon of heaven, which is interesting. It may also have something to do with an entrance to the Hall of Records, maybe. But there's a possible open space up there around where that glyph is, and this is what it looks like on the thermography. So what they think is that there's a possible hidden passage right above that ancient entrance where that glyph is, and then they think this could be a chamber down here on the east side, and it would be under that ancient entrance. So the next step, and this is the great news, is they've Scan Pyramids has had their contract extended for a whole year, so that they can go internally into the Great Pyramid and see if they can map where these openings go and what they lead to. Now again, this isn't the underground caverns that Andrew discovered, Andrew and Nigel, but this is a start. This is finding something in the Great Pyramid that has not been found before, so it's really exciting, and it's exciting that they're allowing this to go on. And to me, it's exciting that these are mainstream people doing it, because that gives it a whole lot more credibility. I've always said that if Greg and I ever really found anything other, and we feel like we have with Brown's Ruins in the Bahamas, we hope that mainstream people will take up the charge, because those are the people who are going to be better believed than we would. All right, so One other thing, I asked John Van Auken the question, I said, well, what about the cave, the Tomb of the Birds and the cave that goes under Giza? Does he think that Zahi will ever go back to that? And his answer was that he asked the question, and they are interested, and they do plan to do something, but they say it'll probably be another year before they can take that step. So it may be that everything's going to open back up in Egypt, and so I see that there are tours planned to Egypt by some of the guys here, and I would say support that if you feel that it's safe enough for you to be there, because that's going to bring all of this back alive again. If they can see they can get our interest, they'll continue to do this kind of research. Now, John wanted to point out, in these are his slides that I'm using here, that this same type of radiography was used to find Nefertiti's tomb inside Tut's tomb. Some of you may be familiar with this, that they've realized that there's more there than just Tut's tomb. Amazing that it's taken this long to find. And they think it may be the tomb of Nefertiti. And you see it's attached to the sides. And what that gives you, though, is hope that possibly in the Great Pyramid there's more there than meets the eye. The chambers and shafts that we're all familiar with are probably not all that's in that particular site. And you realize how large that monument is. Who knows what else is inside? And does it go to to one of the Hall of Records? It's certainly possible. All right, so if you have any interest in finding out more, I've given you really a thumbnail sketch of all of these things. You could, probably your best bet is down here, Atlantis in the Caribbean, which is one of Andrew Collins's many wonderful books, Cygnus Mystery, and Beneath the Pyramids. All of these relate to the Hall of Records. Greg and I have a book with John Van Auken on Edgar Cayce's Atlantis that goes into a whole lot more detail. There's some Edgar Cayce's Story of the Soul, which gives you a really panoramic view of history that's different from what the mainstream gives us. Edgar Evans Cayce, one of the sons of Edgar Cayce, wrote a book really many years ago, Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, and then he updated it about 10 years ago. And then there's a whole series of Edgar Cayce readings just on Atlantis. And then if you want to know more, we post where we are and what we've been doing on AP Magazine info, or you can go to edgarcayce.org, and John Van Auken will keep you up to date on what's going on with the Egypt investigations. All right, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.